My title for this morning, it's not the raciest title I've ever come up with. It's simply some hermeneutical reflections. Yeah, so forgive the title, but generally when I hear the word hermeneutics, I go and check the football results. Actually, this is a really important subject. Let me just start with an illustration. When I was pastoring, I had this one church where there was a particular gentleman. It was in a city in England where we have Rolls-Royce. They make these turbine engines that drive the planes everywhere. And he was an engineer in this church. And every year he would produce a calendar which he would give to his work colleagues. And on the front would be the calendar, and on the reverse he would give Bible texts on a particular subject. It might be family, it might be hope, it might be anything you can imagine. He'd do this every year and hand it out to his colleagues. Great idea. One day he came to me and he said, "Pastor, I'd like you just to check out my calendar." So I looked and I thought, well, the dates seem okay. That's good. Turned it over and started reading. And it was on marriage. And I started reading, Abraham, and he had a couple of bullet points with verses. Abraham, his wives, Jacob, his wives, went through David, his wives, and then he got onto the New Testament section. Elders should only have one wife. And that was it. I just sort of looked at this and I turned to him and I said, what are your work colleagues going to make of this? Yeah, I mean, you haven't sort of explained it. Yeah, and he says, no, I just give the Bible as it is. I just present the text. And I says, well, if I pick this up and just read it as it is, it's a real downer for me as a pastor because it means I can only have one wife. You know? And he was handing this out, and I didn't know what his agenda was because I had a lot of single women in that church. There he was, handing this thing out. It's just the text, Pastor. But you could see there was an agenda going on. Hermeneutics does count. Now, first, let's define what we mean by hermeneutics. And depending on where you're from, your definition will vary. If you're from the US, when we talk about hermeneutics, generally they use the term in relation to how we exegete the text, how we explain what the text means. If you're from Europe, however, hermeneutics is almost a philosophical discipline. It's the whole process of what it means to read the text. There's really quite different approaches to what hermeneutics is. Now, I'm from a Brit, and post-Brexit, I don't know which approach to take. Yeah? Do I go for the American approach? Partly yes, and I'll tell you why. Is that 2 years ago, when I first arrived at the seminary, where they got us all off onto this, to Cancun in Mexico. This is one of the downsides of working at the seminary. And we had a symposium amongst ourselves on what hermeneutics was. And they gave us this book by Craig Bartholomew. The title is An Introduction to Hermeneutics, and it's this thick. I would hate to see what his detailed consideration is of hermeneutics. And I read through this stuff, and it was basically a history of how people have approached the Bible. And at the end of this, I thought, yeah, all very good. I'm the wiser now, but I don't know how it affects how I actually approach the text. How practically does it change what I do with the text? And I didn't see much of a link, to be honest. So what I'm going to do in my 15 minutes left is basically just share where I think the limits of hermeneutics are, and then just to share one or two things that I find personally have really helped me in my Bible study. I want you to have a takeaway from this. So, what is hermeneutics? Well, I've just dealt with that. First thing, with hermeneutics, we need to look in the mirror. We need to recognize what our own approach is. Thanks to postmodernism, nobody claims now to have an absolute final, the way of approaching the text. Everybody recognizes that we come to the text with our historical baggage. Nobody can claim to come up with an objective reading of the text. We're past that. It means that we all need to look in the mirror and look at ourselves and say, what is my history? What is my culture? How does that affect how I read the text? As Adventists, we were highly influenced by William Miller's rules of interpretation. Those were context dependent. They weren't written by angels. They were an expression of post-Enlightenment positivism. The idea that the text is simple, and as long as you get the method right, you get the answer right. In Europe, we had a study, the Value Genesis study, and what it showed is that you can divide Europe through the middle, roughly to the Protestant north, the Catholic Orthodox south. And this was a study on Adventists. And what they found was the approach to the text varied depending on where you live. So if you are from the north, if you're from Norway, for example, you approach the text and you read it in historical context. You're reading Paul's letter to Galatians, and the first question is, who was Paul? Who were the Galatians? What was the situation? And your understanding of the situation affects how you read the text. If you go to somewhere like Portugal or Romania, you read the text very, very differently. I know that. I've been around these countries and talked. We have them in our churches in England. You go to Portugal, and in the seminary, they teach a different approach. You meet the members, and their approach to the text is very much, we open the Bible, and it is God's direct communication to me. I open it, and what is the Lord going to say to me this morning? The historical context moves into the background. Now, I found that the Portuguese are rather nice people. Even though they apply a hermeneutic different from the one I was taught at Newbold, being sort of in the northern part of Europe, they are still on fire for the Lord. And I'm not going to go along to these guys in the south and say, hey, you guys, I am a zealot here to correct the way that you read Scripture. I don't think it's profitable. What I found is I've almost become, when it comes to hermeneutics, not agnostic, but I ask, what's the end result of this approach? What's the end result? And what I see from those who approach a different hermeneutical approach from me, often they are stronger in spiritual areas where I am weak. That's what I've seen. And so in the end, I think we approach with humility and we try and learn from each other. And when I see we breaking down as a church on what the text means, usually it's not at the text level, it's usually been because there's been a breakdown in relationships in the church. Usually that's where different readings arise. If we look at critical methods, how we approach the text, are really an expression of our presuppositions. Let me give you a 2-minute background of critical methodology. Prior to the Reformation, if you wanted to know what the Bible meant, how did you determine what its correct meaning was? You went along to the priest, and the priest told you what the text meant. Along came the Reformation, and the Reformation says basically everybody is a reader. Everybody has the right to say what the text means. And so in this situation, we have a crisis. How do we control, how do we keep unity in the church when basically everybody can come up with their own reading? So initially what Protestantism did was to say, well, how we control the meaning of the text is by locating its meaning in its historical context. And this was the rise of historical criticism. Originally, historical criticism was not an attempt to destroy faith. It was an attempt to sort of hold down the number of proliferating readings and to say, look, if we're going to have church unity, we've got to agree where the meaning of the text is. And Protestants placed it in history. The problem with this approach, historical criticism, and you've got all your different approaches there, was that historians, when they started reading the text, couldn't agree on the history. That's the problem with this approach. is that you read the text and you can ask, well, Paul was writing to the Galatians. Who were the Galatians? Well, that's open to dispute. Is that northern Galatia or southern Galatia? When was it written? Paul didn't write a little introduction for us. It would have been so helpful if he did. But he didn't. And so history becomes the battleground within Protestantism. And it becomes an issue of your historical reading versus mine. Now, as Adventists, we essentially adopt a similar approach. Now, we have the historical grammatical approach. But once, let's recognize the limitations of this approach. We don't know everything about history. And then when it comes to grammar, this is something I have to teach our Greek students. You think you read the English and, oh, it's not quite clear. I learn Hebrew, I learn Greek. And you think you're going to get into this, wow, now the Bible is suddenly clear. It ain't. All you find out is that there's ambiguity in the Greek and in the Hebrew. Is this a subjective genitive or an objective genitive? How do we know? Yeah, you can write 2 or 3 PhDs and you're still guessing. Okay? So this is where we need to have a degree of humility. And this is where, when I come up with a reading, I'm always praying, Lord, send me right in the sky if this is really, really bad. Otherwise, just send a colleague to tell me to go and find something else to do. Yeah? We actually teach our members how to do what we often criticize in our technical journals. You pick up your Sabbath school lesson, and usually the first question is, read this text, how does it apply to your life? In practice, we bypass the history. We actually practice, at the church level, a watered-down version of reader response criticism. That's what I see in practice. Now, here is just 1 or 2 things that I want to share with you as to where I think you can enrich the way you read your text. You're not going to change your history. You're not going to change your historical values. That takes a lifetime of meditating with the text. So, first thing I want to share with you is to model to your members how you want them to read the Bible. The best way to do that is how you use it in your sermons. You have 20 minutes, 40 minutes, or an hour, depending on where you're preaching, to do this every Sabbath morning. Model to them how you want them to read the Bible. And here are just some things that I found useful when I was a pastor. And basically what I do at the seminary is putting into practice what I found useful when I was pastoring. Yeah. The first thing is listen to each biblical author. Yeah. One of the best ways to do this, to get a really good overview of what a biblical text means, is to go onto YouTube. And have you come across the Bible Project? They are fabulous. We use those in our family worships. In our family worships, we go book by book, and the first thing we're doing, if we're going to read Galatians in our family worship, we go and we watch the Bible Project, Galatians. It gives you a 3, 4, 5 minute overview of what the book means. Treat each biblical author as having a voice for themselves. And then if that is the implication of having these 66 books in the canon, we ask the question, what is new in each book? Each author is adding something. Here is a good example. Jesus, during his ministry, you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he tells us a lot about the future, but what he doesn't tell us is what will happen to you if you die before he comes again. You won't find it in Mark 13, you won't find it in Matthew 24, you won't find it in Luke's equivalent or in John. What happens if you die before the Lord comes? So then you start reading 1 Thessalonians. And most of 1 Thessalonians you know from previous books written in the New Testament. But then Paul comes along and he says, I have a word from the Lord, chapter 4. You do not need to grieve as those who have no hope. I have a word of the Lord. And what is it? Is that when the Lord comes, those who've died won't be second-class citizens. They will be caught up. That is the new revelation in 1 Thessalonians. You don't have it in Mark, you don't have it in Matthew. This is a post-gospel revelation. What happens when we move from Galatians to Romans, if you assume that's the order that they were written? We've just done this in Sabbath school. What do we get in Romans that we don't get in Galatians? You can't say Paul wrote Galatians and then expects you to wait for Romans to get the real deal. You've got to read Galatians in its terms, and then when Romans come along, we ask, how has the Lord developed Paul's thinking? We do the same with the synoptics to John. Why is it that when Jesus feeds the 5,000 in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he breaks the bread and hands it to the disciples, who hands it to the 5,000, but in the Gospel of John, he doesn't break the bread. Why? Because it's his body, and he is the Passover lamb, and the Passover lamb, none of its bones should be broken. He hands it direct. He is adding to what we have in the synoptics. We need to appreciate the flavors, the unique flavors of Scripture. As we read each biblical book, we need to understand that they tell us something, but they don't tell us everything. That's why we need the canon. And the best thing I practiced as a pastor was to do 6 months on one biblical book and then move on to another one. And then 6 months. I would spend 3 months just reading through that book again and again and again with a wide margin Bible, writing all my notes around it. And then I would hit the commentaries. As I learned from Lawrence Turner, the commentaries, the Bible really helps you understand the commentaries. Yes? It's always good to start with the Bible first. So make up your mind first when it comes to Scripture before you move on to the commentaries. Here's another thing where I think we can strengthen the way that we read Scripture. And you need to do this as much as I need to do it in my discipline. We have to imagine what the text was doing. It had an impact in its first century, enough so that its recipients say, hey, this is God speaking through this text. The ancient church was made up of Jews, Gentiles, free, slaves, rich, and poor. We know this. New converts, old converts, those who knew the apostles, those who didn't. And within this context, we have to imagine that when James writes about the rich and the poor, that there's some rich here in his congregation and there's some poor over here, and that they are hearing the text differently. We have Jews and Gentiles. We've just been doing Galatians. Galatians is speaking out of the two sides of its mouth. It's saying one thing to Jews and one thing to Gentiles. I wish I could preach like Jesus. He does the same thing in the parable of the prodigal son. He's got two audience groups, the sinners and the tax collectors, the Pharisees over here, and he's telling one story, and I get my students to do this. I put the story in a column, and then I ask, go through and imagine the experience of the different groups. And then you come to chapter 16, and he talks to the disciples, and then at the end of it, we find that the Pharisees are listening in. Jesus could tell a story knowing that it would have multiple impacts. And we have to start imagining. It's not just enough to say, this is what the text means. Generally, members don't come along to church saying, I'm ignorant of Scripture, and if only the pastor will give me enough information, I will be happy. If you teach them like that, they think you're treating them like fools. It's an arrogant approach to members. And so we have to not just read the text and ask what it says, we have to read the text and ask, what does it do? Is my interpretation of the passage, is it informing? Is it affirming? Is it encouraging? Is it warning? Is it unsettling? Does it condemn? A diet of information just offends. It's essentially saying, I am the authority, you are the one in need, here, have it, and accept it on my authority. That's not how God works. So, imagine the reception, and if you do this, you will find that Scripture is like a window that just opens up into multiple rooms. It's a fascinating thing. It's just something which, it transforms you. And as you imagine those different impacts, you will find that your preaching becomes really, really relevant. My eyesight isn't very good. What does it say at the top of the screen on your side? Does it say read the text for the first time? Yeah. Okay, I think this is the final thing I want to say. What I've noticed when I listen to preachers who are really good at talking to non-Christians, yeah, and one preacher who I really like is Timothy Keller. Have you heard of Timothy Keller? Yeah, over in New York, fabulous preacher. You want to listen to his sermons. He's Presbyterian. And he is talking to sort of the jet set of New York. And what he does, and I would encourage you to do this, is to read the text not as if you are an Adventist. Don't bring all that baggage, and for sure that is a great protector from going awry. But imagine as if you are reading the text and you've never read the Bible before. Read it as a secular person would read it. What are the surprises? What are the claims that would shock you? We have to get into the feet of unbelievers who read the text. And the thing is that in our church, we have a whole section of the church who haven't committed yet to the Lord. They are asking these questions, and we are reading it as believers read it and not addressing the questions of unbelievers. We don't even have to go outside the church to meet them. They're there in the church. We keep having babies. Yeah, that's where they come. Yeah. Can't stop them. Yeah. So imagine you have never heard this biblical story. What would strike you as strange, shocking, surprising? And then finally, this is my final appeal. I listen to a lot of sermons, and this is just, it seems really basic, but when I preach a sermon, and I don't know whether I did it last night. If I had an extra 10 minutes, I would have surely have done it. But at the end of the sermon, you write your sermon, you've read the passage. What does it tell you about God? Yeah. I almost wonder whether half our sermons are an expression of idolatry, whether without realizing it, we've shifted the focus away from God and we're talking about the human experience more than we ever talk about God. It's as if he's a minor character in the text. And I just think, hey, what is the purpose of Scripture? It's divine revelation. End. So my appeal is, as you read Scripture, hunger and thirst to learn more about God and communicate that in your sermons. People are hungry not for more psychology. We have that. There's plenty of that there. They want to impact, contact with the divine. And that's our purpose as we read the text and then minister to others through the text. So those are some hermeneutical reflections. God bless.